The food industry, like the tobacco companies and other drug lords, have been able to come up with products that tap into that same dopamine reward system. Why a picture of a cheeseburger rather than sugary soda pop? Well, now we know fat may have similar effects on the brain as well. You feed some people some yogurt packed with butterfat, and within 30 minutes you can start to see the same changes in brain activity you get when you drink sugar water. People who regularly eat ice cream, sugar and fat, have a deadened dopamine response in their brains to drinking a milkshake. It's like when drug abusers have to use more and more to get the same high. Frequent ice cream consumption is related to a reduction in reward region responsivity in humans. They're talking about the pleasure center in the brain, paralleling the tolerance observed in drug addiction. Once we've so dulled our dopamine response, we may subsequently overeat in an effort to achieve the degree of satisfaction experienced previously, which contributes to unhealthy weight gain. What do fatty, sugary foods have in common? They are energy-dense foods. It may be less the number of calories than their concentration. Consumption of a calorie-dense diet, compared to the same number of calories in a calorie-dilute diet, leads to that numbing of the dopamine response. It's like the difference between cocaine and crack. Same stuff chemically, but by smoking crack cocaine, we can deliver the kind of a higher dose quicker to our brain. As an aside, I found it interesting that the control drink in these milkshake studies wasn't just water. They can't use water because our brain can actually taste water on the tongue. I didn't know that. So they had to use artificial saliva. They made people drink a solution designed to mimic the natural taste of saliva. Ew. Anyway, with this new understanding of the neural correlates of food addiction, there have been calls to include obesity as an official mental disorder. After all, both obesity and addiction share the inability to restrain behavior in spite of an awareness of detrimental health consequences. That's one of the defining criteria of substance abuse. You keep putting crap in your body, despite the knowledge that you have a problem that is likely caused by the crap. Yet you can't stop. Redefining obesity as an addiction, as a psychiatric disease, would be a boon to drug companies that are already working on a whole bunch of drugs to muck with our brain chemistry. For example, you give people an opiate blocker, like they do for people with heroin overdoses to block the effects of the drug, and people eat significantly less cheese. It just doesn't do as much for them anymore when their opiate receptors are blocked. Rather than taking drugs, though, we can prevent the deadening of our pleasure center in the first place by sticking to foods that are naturally calorically dilute, like whole plant foods. This can help bring back our dopamine sensitivity such that we can again derive the same pleasure from the simplest of foods. And this is not just for people who are obese. Yes, when we regularly eat calorie-dense animal and junk foods like ice cream, we can blunt our pleasure center and overeat to compensate. But when our brain downregulates dopamine receptors to deal with all these jolts of fat and sugar, we may experience less enjoyment from other activities as well. That's why cocaine addicts may have an impaired neurological capacity to enjoy sex, why smokers also have an impaired ability to respond to positive stimuli. Since these all involve the same dopamine pathways, what we put into our body, what we eat, can affect how we experience all of life's pleasures. So to live life to the fullest, what's the solution? Well, the food industry, according to some addiction specialists, should be given incentives to develop low-calorie foods that are more attractive, palatable, and affordable, so that people can adhere to diet programs for a long time. No need. Mother Nature beat them all to it. Pesticides have been classified as probable carcinogens for 25 years, and different pesticides have been associated with different kinds of cancers through a variety of mechanisms, both genetic damage directly to our DNA or chromosomes, or epigenetic modification, changing the way our genes are expressed. But that's for workers who are spraying them. Exposure to pesticide residues that remain on the food are at much lower levels. More recently, higher cancer rates have been noted in those that live in areas where they spray a lot. But what about just the food we buy at the store? Organic fruits and vegetables have fewer pesticides, but even the levels on conventional produce are generally well below accepted limits. There's still scientific controversy about the safety of some pesticides, even under the limit, given the possible additive effects of mixtures of pesticides we're exposed to, something that isn't necessarily taken into account in the pesticide approval process. They also don't take into account toxic breakdown products like dioxins that can form once pesticides are released into the environment. Cadmium is another issue. In the largest review to date, involving hundreds of studies, not only did organic foods have more antioxidant phytonutrients, but lower concentrations of cadmium. That's a good thing. Cadmium is one of 3 highly toxic heavy metals, along with lead and mercury, found in the food supply. It accumulates in the body, and so we should try to keep intake as low as possible. Thus, the fact that organic crops only have about half the cadmium is therefore desirable. The cadmium is thought to come from the phosphate fertilizers that are added to conventional crops. Of course, not all organic foods are healthy. The organic food industry is now worth tens of billions of dollars. They didn't get that way just selling carrots. We can now buy pesticide-free potato chips and organic jelly beans. Organic foods aren't necessarily healthy foods. In fact, can even be worse because people, for example, falsely judge organic Oreo cookies to have fewer calories than conventional Oreos, and so may eat more. Foregoing exercise was deemed more acceptable when the person had just chosen organic rather than conventional dessert. In fact, leniency towards foregoing exercise was slightly greater after choosing an organic dessert than after eating no dessert at all. Organic cookies were viewed as having negative calories. But organic junk food is still junk food. Not only do people tend to overestimate the nutritional benefits of organic foods, they also overestimate the risks of pesticides. People think that as many people die from pesticide residues on conventional food as die in motor vehicle accidents in the United States. Organic food buyers may think eating conventional produce is almost as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes. That kind of thinking is dangerous because it could potentially lead to a decrease in overall fruit and vegetable consumption. If just half the U.S. population were to increase fruit and vegetable consumption by a single serving a day, an estimated 20,000 cancer cases might be avoided each year. That's how powerful produce may be. But because the model was using conventional fruits and veggies, the pesticide residues on those extra fruits and vegetables would result in 10 additional cancer cases. So overall,
If half of us just ate one more serving, we'd just prevent 19,990 cases of cancer every year. Now, this was a paper written by scientists for hire paid for by the Alliance for Food and Farming, which is a bunch of conventional produce growers, so they probably exaggerated the benefits and minimized the risks. But I think the bottom line is sound. We get a tremendous benefit from eating conventional fruits and vegetables that far outweighs whatever tiny bump in risk from the pesticides. But hey, why accept any risk at all when you can choose organic? I agree. But we should never let concern about pesticides stop us from stuffing our face with as many fruits and vegetables as possible.
Probably about a third of common cancers can be prevented by eating a healthy, plant-based diet, being physically active, and maintaining a healthy weight. One of the ways plants may help is by cutting off the supply lines to cancerous tumors. A tumor cannot grow without a blood supply. Currently, it's believed that a tumor mass cannot exist in a volume greater than about the size of the ball at the tip of a ballpoint pen without a proper blood supply, which indicates that angiogenesis — angio means vessel, so the genesis, the creation of new blood vessels, is critical to tumor growth. Each one of us has cancer cells in us right now. By age 70, microscopic cancers are detected in the thyroid glands of virtually everyone, for example. Most of these tumors never cause problems, never become clinically significant, leading to the concept of cancer without disease as a normal state during aging. Cancer cells are commonly present in the body, but they can't grow into tumors any bigger than that tiny dot size, no more than 10 million cancer cells, before needing to get hooked up to a blood supply. So, tumors diabolically release angiogenic factors, chemicals, that cause new blood vessels to sprout into the tumor. The most important one is called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor. But we can suppress VEGF with veggies. Many of the phytonutrients we know and love in tea and spices and fruit and berries and broccoli and beans can block cancer's stimulation of new blood vessels. They're ideal for prophylactic long-term use against breast cancer because of their reliability, availability, safety, and affordable price. Dietary agents used to suppress angiogenesis may be an important step in the prevention and treatment of breast cancer, and in fact, all types of tumors. The review concludes that we now have convincing evidence that dietary plant constituents possess the unique ability to affect tumor angiogenesis, which may be deemed advantageous in the prevention and treatment of human breast cancer. Most of these studies have only been done in a petri dish, though. You stimulate human blood vessel cells, and they start forming these tubular structures, trying to make new capillaries to feed the tumor. But if you add plant flavones like apigenin or luteolin, found throughout the plant kingdom, like in citrus, celery, and peppers, you can see they help block the tube formation. Here's the effect of fisetin, a phytonutrient found in strawberries and other fruits and veggies. It just shrinks the beginnings of new blood vessel formation right on down. Where do researchers get their hands on human blood vessels? From human umbilical vein endothelial cells. They get them from discarded umbilical cords, or more controversially, from the eyes of aborted fetuses. But either way, you can stimulate blood vessel formation with the tumor compound VEGF, and then abolish that effect with plant compounds, in this case from purple rice. Therefore, the daily consumption of natural foods containing adequate flavonoids could be beneficial for the prevention of cancer metastasis, or could improve cancer prognosis. Given the power of plants, one might speculate that the foundation of an anti-angiogenic approach to cancer might be a whole food, vegan diet.
The United States has one of the highest premature birth rates in the world, now ranking 131st worldwide. Even worse, over the last few decades, the rate of preterm birth in the U.S. has been going up. We've known that preterm delivery is associated with significant problems during infancy and almost 3/4 of all infant deaths, but even preemies who survive past infancy can carry a legacy of health issues, such as behavioral problems, and moderate to severe neurodevelopmental disabilities and psychiatric disorders in half of those born extremely preterm by the time they reach school age. There's even evidence now that adults born very premature are at increased risk for things like heart disease and diabetes, and babies don't even have to be born that premature to suffer long-term effects. Even so-called near-term births at 36 or 37 weeks are now thought to be related to subtle developmental problems. So, what can pregnant women do to decrease this risk? I've talked about avoiding aspartame and diet soda consumption during pregnancy, but what about food? 66,000 pregnant women were studied to examine whether an association exists between maternal dietary patterns and risk of preterm delivery. They compared a so-called prudent diet, which was more plant-based, versus a Western diet or traditional Scandinavian diet, and found that the prudent pattern was associated with significantly reduced risk of preterm delivery. Their findings suggest that diet matters. But why and how? Well, inflammation is thought to play a role in triggering delivery, and so a diet characterized by anti-inflammatory foods, high intakes of vegetables, fruits, and berries, can reduce both systemic and local inflammation, and the lower saturated fat levels may also be associated with reduced inflammation. Any good foods in particular? Well, since a significant percentage of preterm deliveries are thought to be related to infections and inflammatory conditions in the genital tract, what about looking into garlic? Garlic is well known for its antimicrobial properties, and also has these prebiotic dietary fibers that feed our good bacteria. Speaking of which, dried fruit packed with fiber also have some antimicrobial activities against some of the bacteria suspected to play a role in preterm delivery. So they studied the garlic, onion, and dried fruit intake of nearly 19,000 pregnant women, and indeed, they observed a reduced risk of spontaneous preterm delivery related to groups of garlic and onion family vegetables and dried fruit. In particular, garlic stood out for the vegetables and raisins for the dried fruit, associated with a reduced risk of both preterm delivery and preterm pre-labor rupture of membranes, which means you're water breaking prematurely before 37 weeks. And it didn't seem to take much. The so-called high garlic intake, associated with the lowest risk, was just about 1 clove a week or more, and high raisin intake was defined as just like one of those little mini snack boxes of raisins a month. So if the phytates in beans are so successful in preventing cancer and re-educating cancer cells, let's put them to the test. Colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death in the United States, and it arises from what are called neoplastic adenomatous polyps, meaning colon cancer starts out as a benign little bump called a polyp, and then grows into cancer that can eventually spread to other organs and kill us. So the National Cancer Institute funded the polyp prevention trial to determine the effects of a high-fiber, high-fruit and vegetable, low-fat diet. They found no significant associations between polyp formation and overall changes in fruit and vegetable consumption. However, those with the greatest increase in bean intake only had about 1/3 of the odds of advanced polyps popping up. Yes, it could have been the fiber in the beans, but there's lots of fiber in fruits and vegetables too, so maybe it was the phytate. If the tumors do grow, though, they still need to spread. Tumor growth, invasion, and metastasis are multi-step processes that includes not just cell proliferation, but invasion through the surrounding tissue and migration through basement membranes to reach the bloodstream before the tumor can establish new proliferating colonies of cancer cells. The first step is to tunnel through the surrounding matrix, considered a critical event in tumor cell invasion. To do this, the cancer cells use a set of enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, which is where phytates may come in.
We know phytates inhibit cancer cell migration in vitro, and now perhaps we know why. They help block the ability of cancer cells to produce the tumor invasion enzyme in the first place, in both human colon cancer cells and human breast cancer. Thus, phytates could be used not only in the early promotion state of cancer, but also in all stages of cancer progression. So what happens if you give phytates to breast cancer patients? Although a few case studies in which phytates were given in combination with chemotherapy clearly showed encouraging data, organized, controlled, randomized clinical studies were never organized, until now. 14 women with invasive breast cancer divided into 2 randomized groups. One group got extra phytates, the other got placebo. At the end of 6 months, the phytate group had a better quality of life, significantly more functional, and fewer symptoms from the chemo, not getting the drop in immune cells and platelets one normally experiences. And what are the potential side effects of phytates? Less heart disease, less diabetes, fewer kidney stones? Because cancer development is such an extended process, can take decades to grow, we need cancer preventive agents that we can take long-term, and phytates, naturally occurring in beans, grains, nuts, and seeds, fit the bill. Although in the past concerns have been expressed regarding intake of foods high in phytates reducing the bioavailability of dietary minerals, recent studies demonstrate that this so-called anti-nutrient effect can be manifested only when large quantities of phytates are consumed in combination with a nutrient-poor diet. For example, there used to be concern that phytate consumption might lead to calcium deficiency, but in fact researchers discovered the opposite to be true, phytates instead protecting against osteoporosis. In essence, phytate has many characteristics of a vitamin, contrary to the established and unfortunately still existing dogma among nutritionists about its quote-unquote anti-nutrient role. Given the numerous health benefits, its participation in important intracellular biochemical pathways, normal physiological presence in our cells and tissues and blood, and the levels which fluctuate with intake, epidemiologic correlates of phytate deficiency with disease, and reversal of those conditions with adequate intake and safety, all strongly suggest for phytate's inclusion as an essential nutrient, perhaps a vitamin. Meanwhile, inclusion of phytates in our strategies for prevention and therapy of various ailments, cancer in particular, is warranted. Now, they're talking about trying out supplements, but of course, eating a healthy diet rich in phytates would always be a prudent thing to do. In addition to suppressing liver cancer growth in vitro, cranberries have often been found to have similar effects against human breast, colon, brain tumor, oral, and ovarian cancer cells. Here's the latest looking at prostate cancer cell growth. The United States has the highest rate of prostate cancer in the world, so let's try a Native American fruit. Researchers started out with about 50,000 human prostate cancer cells in a Petri dish, and if you do nothing, within a day you're closer to 100,000, then 200,000, then nearly 400,000 within 72 hours. But by adding just a smidgen of cranberries, or 2 smidgens, you can see they block that exponential cancer growth. The reason they tested such tiny concentrations is that we only absorb a small fraction of the cranberry phytonutrients we eat into our bloodstream. Still, cranberries are cheap. If drug companies and supplement manufacturers are going to capitalize on this, they need to define cranberries' active ingredient. Here's some of the various phytonutrients in cranberries, so different fractions were tested against various types of cancer to find the magic bullet. Yes, the anthocyanin phytonutrients inhibit colon cancer cell proliferation, about 15%, for example, about the same with the proanthocyanidin fraction, but nothing compared to the total cranberry extract of the whole fruit. There seemed to be an additive or synergistic anti-proliferative effects resulting from a combination of the various components compared to individual purified phytochemicals. So it's always better to eat the whole fruit. How do you do that with cranberries, though? Although 5% of cranberries are sold fresh, the vast majority are consumed as processed products. To get the same amount of anthocyanin and phytonutrients in a cup of fresh or frozen cranberries, you'd have to drink 16 cups of cranberry juice cocktail, eat 7 cups of dried cranberries, or 26 cans of cranberry sauce. The problem is that raw cranberries are so tart that folks may opt for the dried. In a taste test survey, consumers said they wouldn't mind eating sweetened cranberries every day, whereas raw cranberries sloped down towards maybe once a year. The problem is dried cranberries tend to come sweetened. Raw cranberries don't affect your blood sugar, but sweetened dried cranberries do, even the low-sugar varieties. What about cranberry juice, or shall I say, quote-unquote juice? Cranberry cocktail is only about a quarter cranberry juice. The ruby red phytonutrients in cranberries and pure cranberry juice are powerful antioxidants, increasing the antioxidant capacity of our bloodstream within hours of consumption. But the high-fructose corn syrup acts as a pro-oxidant, even if you add vitamin C to it, as they did here, canceling out some of the cranberry benefit. So how do you get the upsides without the down? Check out my pink juice video, where I offer a recipe for making no-sugar-added whole fruit cranberry cocktail. More than 85% of breast cancers are sporadic, and attributable to long-term exposure to environmental carcinogens, such as those in the diet, through a multi-step disease process progressing from non-cancerous to pre-malignant and malignant stages. Now, we know that the chemical carcinogen PHIP is one of the most abundant heterocyclic amines found in high-temperature cooked meats, and is recognized as a breast carcinogen. However, the PHIP's mechanism of action in breast cell carcinogenesis is not completely clear. How does it do it? Well, in this landmark new study, they demonstrated for the first time that cumulative exposures to PHIP at the kind of concentrations one would expect just eating meat effectively induced progressive carcinogenesis, cancer transformation of normal human breast cells from a non-cancerous stage to pre-malignant and malignant stages in a dose and exposure-dependent manner. From start to finish, they started out with normal human breast cells, and were able to transmute them completely into cancer cells, just using that cooked meat carcinogen found predominantly in fried bacon, fish, and chicken. That's all it took, and Jekyll becomes Hyde. Now, PHIP was already established as a carcinogen. The reason they did this study was to develop a model of human breast cancer carcinogenesis from beginning to end, so they could test various interventions to see if they could somehow stop this process of cancer formation. For example, 3 recent meta-analyses reviewing all the epidemiological or population-based evidence concerning green tea consumption and breast cancer risk to date concluded that green tea consumption may be protected. OK, let's put the plant to the test. Here's how normal human breast cells rate against 6 different measures of cancer potential. Add some green tea to them, and nothing much happens. Add repeated exposure to the cooked meat carcinogen PHIP, though, and all the cancer indicators go up. OK, here's the test. What happens if you now add the meat carcinogen with green tea phytonutrients? The transformation of breast cancer is blunted across the board, almost bringing cancer markers back to normal. Using a variety of measures, green tea phytonutrients were capable of suppressing PHIP-induced cellular cancer and tumor progression. When the Women's Health Initiative study found that menopausal women taking hormone replacement therapy suffered higher rates of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and overall harm, a call was made
for safer alternatives. Yes, estrogen has positive effects, the Women's Health Initiative found, such as reducing menopausal symptoms and improving bone health, reducing hip fracture risk, but also negative effects, increasing the risk of blood clots in the heart, brain, and lungs, as well as breast cancer. So ideally, to get the best of both worlds, we need what's called a selective estrogen receptor modulator, something that has pro-estrogenic effects in some tissues, like bone, but anti-estrogenic effects in other tissues, like the breast. Drug companies are trying to make them, but phytoestrogens, natural compounds in plants like genistein and soybeans that are structurally similar to estrogen, appear to function as natural selective estrogen receptor modulators. How could something that looks like estrogen act as an anti-estrogen? The original theory for how soy phytoestrogens control breast cancer growth is that they compete with our own estrogens for binding to the estrogen receptor. As you drip more and more soy compounds on breast cancer cells in a petri dish, less and less actual estrogen is able to bind to them. So the estrogen-blocking ability of phytoestrogens can help explain their anti-estrogenic effects. But how do we then explain their pro-estrogenic effects on other tissues like bone? How can soy have it both ways? The mystery was solved when we discovered there are two types of estrogen receptors in the body, and so how a target cell responds depends on which type of estrogen receptors they have. This may be the key to understanding the health protective potential of soy phytoestrogens, the existence of this newly discovered estrogen receptor called estrogen receptor beta, to distinguish it from the classic estrogen receptor alpha. And unlike our body's own estrogen, soy phytoestrogens preferentially bind to the beta receptors. If you have people eat about a cup of cooked whole soybeans, within about 8 hours, genistein levels in the blood reach about 20 to 50 nanomoles. That's how much is circulating throughout our body, bathing our cells. About half is bound up to proteins in the blood, so the effective concentration is about half that. So let's see what that means for estrogen receptor activation. This is the graph that explains the mysterious health benefits of soy foods. Down around the effective levels you'd get eating a cup of soybeans, there's very little alpha activation, but lots of beta activation. So now let's look at where each of these receptors are located in the human body. The way estrogen pills increase the risk of fatal blood clots is by causing the liver to dump out all these extra clotting factors. But guess what? The human liver only contains alpha estrogen receptors, not beta receptors, and so maybe if we ate like 30 cups of soybeans a day, that could be a problem. But at the kinds of concentrations one would get with just normal soy consumption, no wonder this is a problem with drug estrogens, but not soy phytoestrogens. The effects on the uterus appear also to be mediated solely by alpha receptors, which is presumably why no negative impact has been seen with soy. So while estrogen-containing drugs may increase the risk of endometrial cancer up to tenfold, phytoestrogen-containing foods are associated with significantly less endometrial cancer. In fact, protective effects for these types of gynecological cancers in general. Women who ate the most soy had 30% less endometrial cancer and appeared to cut their ovarian cancer risk nearly in half. Soy phytoestrogens don't appear to have any effect on the lining of the uterus, but still can dramatically improve menopausal symptoms. The Kupperman Index is like a compilation of all 11 of the most common menopausal symptoms. In terms of bone health, human bone cells carry beta estrogen receptors, so we might expect soy phytoestrogens to be protective, and indeed they do seem to significantly increase bone mineral density, consistent with population data suggesting high consumption of soy products is associated with increased bone mass. But can they prevent bone loss over time? Soy milk was compared to a transdermal progesterone cream. The control group lost significant bone mineral density in their spine over the 2-year study period, but the progesterone group lost significantly less, and the 2 glasses of soy milk a day group ended up actually better than when they started.
This is probably the most robust study to date, comparing the soy phytoestrogen genistein to a more traditional hormone replacement drug regimen. In the spine, over a year, the placebo group lost bone density, but gained in the phytoestrogen and estrogen groups, and the same with the hip bones. The study clearly shows that the soy phytoestrogen prevents bone loss and enhances new bone formation, in turn producing a net gain of bone mass. But the only reason we care about bone mass is we want to prevent fractures. Is soy food consumption associated with lower fracture risk? Yes. A significantly lower risk of bone fracture associated with just a single serving of soy a day, the equivalent of 5 to 7 grams of soy protein, or 20 to 30 milligrams of phytoestrogens. So that's just like 1 cup of soy milk, or even better, a serving of a whole soy food like tempeh, or edamame, or the beans themselves. We don't have fracture data on soy supplements, though, so if we seek the types of health benefits we presume Asian populations get from eating whole and traditional soy foods, maybe we should look to eating those rather than taking unproven protein powders or pills. Is there anyone who should avoid soy? Well, some people have soy allergies, but a national survey found that only about 1 in 2,000 people report a soy allergy. That's 40 times less than the most common allergen, dairy milk, and about 10 times less than all the other common allergens like fish, eggs, shellfish, nuts, wheat, or peanuts. Unfortunately, as the traditional diets of East Asia westernize, their breast cancer rates have risen, which some have linked to a quadrupling of animal product consumption. This is the breast cancer rate of Japanese women in Japan. If they emigrate to the United States, within 10 years they're up to here, and if they hang around long enough, here's the risk of resident Japanese Americans living in the United States. Note, though, that's still somewhat lower than the U.S. national average. This may be because some of the dietary habits may carry with them, such as soy consumption, green tea, maybe eating more mushrooms, but maybe partly it's the seaweed. We've known for over a decade that in vitro, in a petri dish, seaweed broth is effective at clearing cancer cells. Here's 3 different types of human breast cancer, measuring cancer cell death. Here's what a widely used chemotherapy drug can do, and here's seaweed. Worked even better, and, unlike the chemo, didn't harm normal, non-cancerous breast cells. But what about outside of the test tube in people? Well, a population study comparing women with breast cancer to women without found that consuming a single sheet of nori a day may cut a woman's odds of breast cancer in half. We think it's because seaweed favorably alters estrogen metabolism, likely due to a modulation of the woman's gut bacteria. It appears that the more seaweed you eat, the less estrogen you have in your system, which may lower breast cancer risk. This may be because of all the fiber in sea vegetables, or it may block the enzyme that undermines our body's attempt to flush out excess hormones, or even somehow interfere with estrogen binding to estrogen receptors. Either way, to effectively lower one's estrogen levels, Asian women may be able to get away with maybe 1 sheet of nori a day, but American women are so much bigger that may take closer to 2. There's lots of yummy seaweed snacks out there to make it a tasty experience. Just try to get some low-fat, low-sodium ones. Wakame, the seaweed used fresh in seaweed salads, unfortunately did not appear to reduce breast cancer risk, though it has been found to rather dramatically lower blood pressure in hypertensives. Just 2 teaspoons of seaweed salad a day for a month dropped their blood pressure 14 points, and after 2 months was associated with up to a 2-inch skinnier waistline. As I've mentioned before, though, I recommend avoiding hijiki, which tends to have too much arsenic, and kelp, which tends to have
too much iodine. In fact, too much seaweed of any type may actually increase one's risk of thyroid cancer because of the amount of iodine you'd be taking in, but there does not appear to be increased risk at the levels of consumption I'm talking about, like a sheet of nori a day. And a study of seaweed eaters in California actually found decreased risk, but again, we're talking kind of modest levels of intake. I've frequently talked about the benefits of dietary diversity, eating different families of fruits and vegetables, eating different parts of individual plants, like beets and beet greens. If we just stick to land plants, though, we're missing out on all the plants from the other 70% of planet Earth. Sea vegetables have phytonutrients found nowhere else, types of fiber and unique carotenoids and polysaccharides and various polyphenol defense compounds, each of which may have anti-cancer properties. So, I encourage everyone to try experimenting with sea vegetables until you find one you like, even if that just means sprinkling some powdered dulse on your food. Cadmium is known as a highly toxic metal that represents a major hazard to human health. It sticks around in our body for decades because our body has no efficient way to get rid of it, and may contribute to a variety of illnesses, including heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Most recently, data suggest cadmium exposure may impair cognitive performance even at levels once thought to be safe. Recent studies suggest cadmium exposure may produce adverse health effects at lower exposure levels than previously predicted, including increased risk of hormonal cancers. For example, researchers on Long Island estimated that about 40% of breast cancer in the U.S. may be associated with elevated cadmium levels. Inhalation of cigarette smoke is one of the major routes for human exposure to cadmium. Seafood consumption is another dominant route of human exposure, in this study even more so than from cigarette smoke. The highest levels, though, are found in organ meats. But how many horse kidneys can you eat? Because people eat so few organs, grains and vegetables actually end up contributing the largest amount. But wait a second, whole grains and vegetables are among the major dietary sources of fiber, phytoestrogens, antioxidants that may protect against breast cancer. And indeed, even though the risk of breast cancer goes up as women consume more and more cadmium, even though on paper most cadmium comes from grains and vegetables, breast cancer risk goes down the more whole grains and vegetables women eat. So maybe the animal-sourced cadmium is somehow worse, or the benefits of the plant foods just overwhelm any adverse effects of the cadmium? This study may have helped solve the mystery. It's not what we eat, it's what we absorb. Cadmium bioavailability from animal-based foods may be higher than from vegetable-based foods. There appears to be something in plants that inhibits cadmium absorption. In fact, if you add kale to your boiled pig kidneys, you can cut down on toxic exposure. Just 1 tablespoon of pig kidney, we may exceed the daily safety limit unless we eat kale, in which case we could eat a whole quarter cup. The pronounced effects of the inhibitory factors in kale points out the importance of vegetable foods in terms of prevention of health hazards from cadmium ingested as mixed diets in a real situation. Even if a vegetarian diet contains more lead and cadmium than a mixed diet, it's not certain that it will give rise to higher uptake of the metals because the absorption of lead and cadmium is inhibited by plant compounds such as fiber and phytate. And it's not just in lab animals. Having whole grains in our stomach up to 3 hours before we swallow lead can eliminate 90% of absorption, thought to be due to phytates in whole grains, beans, and nuts grabbing onto it. So vegetarians may have lower levels even though they have higher intakes. In fact, a significant decrease in the hair concentrations of lead and cadmium was seen after the change from an omnivorous to a vegetarian diet, indicating a lower absorption of the metals. Here's that study. They took folks eating a standard Swedish diet and put them on a vegetarian diet. Lots of whole, unrefined plant foods, no meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and junk food was discouraged. Here's where they started out. A measure of their mercury levels, cadmium level, and lead levels in their bodies. Within 3 months on a vegetarian diet, their levels significantly dropped, and stayed down for the rest of the year-long experiment. But then they came back 3 years later, 3 years after they stopped eating vegetarian. And what did they find? Their levels of mercury, cadmium, and lead shot back up. Since the cadmium in plants is based on the cadmium in soil, plant eaters that live in a really polluted area like Slovakia, which has some of the highest levels, the so-called black triangle of pollution, thanks to the chemical and smelting industries. Those who eat lots of plants there can indeed build up higher cadmium levels, especially if you eat lots of plants. It's interesting, in spite of the significantly higher blood cadmium concentrations as a consequence of greater cadmium intake from polluted plants, all the antioxidants in those same plants were found to help inhibit the harmful effects of higher free radical production caused by the cadmium exposure. Still, though, in highly polluted areas, it might be especially a good idea not to smoke or eat too much seafood or organ meats. But even if we live in the Slovak Republic's black triangle of pollution, the benefits of whole plant foods would outweigh the risks. In highly polluted areas, zinc supplements may decrease cadmium absorption, but I'd recommend against multi-mineral supplements, as they've been found to be contaminated with cadmium itself. According to the Swine Information Center, pork is an excellent source of a number of nutrients, including iron and zinc. When you see on a label that something or other is a quote-unquote good source of some nutrient, that's actually a legal definition, meaning it has to have at least 10% of the daily value of that particular nutrient. It says nothing about the excellence of the food source itself. So, for example, you could throw a multivitamin into a scoop of sewer sludge and legally call it a good source of half a dozen things, but it would probably kill you. It's not good at all. It always comes back to food as a package deal. It is impossible to get the calcium in dairy, for example, without also getting the hormones, or the iron in beef without the saturated fat. So these aren't necessarily good sources of nutrients after all, because we can't get one without the other. Unless we get our nutrients from non-animal sources, then we don't have to worry about the saturated animal fat, cholesterol, and the rest. And there's a bonus that comes when we get, for example, our iron and zinc from whole grains, greens, beans, nuts, and seeds, the fiber, folate, phytonutrients, etc. It's a package deal, but in a good way. It's like, order now and get a free gift. One of those phytonutrients, though, phytates, or phytic acid, from the Greek word phyton, meaning plant, can partially inhibit mineral absorption. Now, phytates are actually good for us. They have a wide range of health-promoting properties, such as anti-cancer activity. But because it binds up some of the minerals, that just means one has to eat more whole, healthy plant foods, or eat mineral absorption enhancers, such as garlic and onions. In fact, the whole allium family of vegetables was recently found to have promoting influences on the bioaccessibility of iron and zinc. Here's the bioaccessibility of iron and zinc in a serving of brown rice, cooked with 1 clove of garlic, cooked with 2 cloves of garlic. We see the same thing with onions. Here's normalized data for brown rice plain, then eaten at the same meal with 1 thin slice of onion, or 2 thin slices of onion. So up to 50% more absorption. But if you don't like garlic and onions, then you can get the same mineral absorption from just eating a whole grain serving and a half. The dietary guidelines recommend that we try to choose meals or snacks that are high in nutrients but lower in calories to reduce the risk of chronic disease. By this measure, the healthiest foods on the planet, the most nutrient-dense, are vegetables, containing the most nutrient bang for our caloric buck. So what would happen if a population centered their entire diet around vegetables? They might end up living among the longest lives in the world. Of course, anytime you hear about long-living populations, you have to make sure it's validated, as it may be hard to find birth certificates from the 1890s. But validation studies suggest that indeed, they really do live that long. The traditional diet in Okinawa is based on vegetables, beans, and other plants. I'm used to seeing the Okinawan diet represented like this, the base being vegetables, beans, and grains, but a substantial contribution from fish and other meat. But a more accurate representation would be this. If you look at their actual dietary intake, we know what they're eating from the U.S. National Archives, because the U.S. military ran Okinawa until it was given back to Japan in 1972. And if you look at the traditional diets of more than 2,000 Okinawans, this is how it breaks down. Only 1% of their diet was fish. Less than 1% of their diet was meat, and same with eggs and dairy. So it was more than 96% plant-based, and more than 90% whole food plant-based, very few processed foods either. And not just whole food plant-based, but most of their diet was vegetables, and one vegetable in particular, sweet potatoes. The Okinawan diet was centered around purple and orange sweet potatoes. How delicious is that? Could have been bitter gourd or soursop, but no, sweet potatoes. So 90+% whole food plant-based makes it a highly anti-inflammatory diet, makes it a highly antioxidant diet. If you measure the level of oxidized fat within their system, there's compelling evidence of less free radical damage. Maybe they're just genetically have better antioxidant enzymes or something? No. Their antioxidant enzyme activity is the same. It's all the extra antioxidants they're getting from their diet that may be making the difference. Most of their diet is vegetables. So, 8 to 12 times fewer heart disease deaths than the U.S. You can see they ran out of room for the graph for our death rate. 2 to 3 times fewer colon cancer deaths, 7 times fewer prostate cancer deaths, and 5.5 times lower risk of dying from breast cancer. Some of this protection may be because they're only eating about 1,800 calories a day, but they were actually eating a greater mass of food, but the whole plant foods are just calorically dilute. There's also a cultural norm not to stuff oneself. The plant-based nature of the diet may trump the caloric restriction, though, since the one population that lives even longer than the Okinawa Japanese don't just eat a 98% meat-free diet, they eat 100% meat-free. The Adventist vegetarians in California, with perhaps the highest life expectancy of any formally described population. Adventist vegetarian men and women live to be about 83 and 86, comparable to Okinawan women, but better than Okinawan men. The best of the best were Adventist vegetarians who had healthy lifestyles too, like exercising non-smokers, 87 and nearly 90 on average. That's like 10 to 14 years longer than the general population. 10 to 14 extra years on this earth from simple lifestyle choices. And this is happening now, in modern times, whereas Okinawan longevity is now a thing of the past. Okinawa now hosts more than a dozen KFCs. Their saturated fat tripled. They went from eating essentially no cholesterol to a few Big Macs worth, tripled their sodium, and are now just as potassium deficient as Americans, getting less than half of the recommended minimum daily intake of 4,700 milligrams a day. In 2 generations, Okinawans have gone from the leanest Japanese to the fattest. As a consequence, there's been a resurgence of interest from public health professionals in getting Okinawans to eat the Okinawan diet too.
The total antioxidant capacity of our diet may also be protective against stroke. in contradiction to all the pill studies that failed to show benefit. But what they did in this study was to take into account all antioxidants present in actual food in the diet, including thousands of compounds and doses obtained from a usual diet, not one or two in high doses in pill form. Stroke is the world's leading cause of death after heart disease. The buildup of oxidized fat is considered the hallmark of fatty streak formation, the earliest manifestation of atherosclerotic plaques. Yes, the oxidation of fat can happen outside the body every time we cook it, but oxidized fats are not only formed in foods, but may also be generated during digestion, especially in stomach acid. Our stomach may be like a bioreactor for the oxidation of high-fat, cholesterol-rich foods. See, muscle foods contain large amounts of endogenous catalysts which accelerate fat oxidation. As poultry sits in our stomach, the oxidation may build up minute by minute. See, chickens are bled of only about half their blood, and the remaining residual can be a powerful promoter of fat oxidation. So there are those in the industry advocating an additional decapitation step to reduce all that oxidation. But if oxidation is the problem, antioxidants may be part of the solution. Total antioxidant capacity from diet and risk of heart attack. Well, we know antioxidant pills don't work, while extensive experimental data have revealed a central role for oxidative stress in the stiffening of our arteries, and suggested a potential role for antioxidant treatment in cardiovascular disease. Experimental data has not translated into clinical benefit. Most antioxidant vitamin trials have failed to reduce heart disease and death, and may in fact even be detrimental. As a result, some have even questioned the supposed central role of oxidative stress in the disease process, described as a critical blow to the whole free radical theory of aging, the fact that pills didn't work. But high-dose single antioxidant supplements are not a good substitute for the very complex antioxidant network of thousands of compounds in foods, present at concentrations far below those used in the pill trials. No one had ever looked at the overall effect of the complex antioxidant network in diet in relation to our leading killer, coronary heart disease, until now. The total antioxidant capacity measures in one single value the free radical reducing capacity of all antioxidants present in foods and all the synergistic effects. And in this large prospective population-based cohort study, they observed that higher total antioxidant capacity of diet was associated with lower risk of incident heart attack in a dose-response manner, meaning potentially the more high antioxidant plant foods in our diet, the better.